Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. Listener discretion is advised. You hear the phrase, happy wife, happy life, a lot. It seems to put the onus on the woman to keep the marriage in calm waters. But that's not always how it's meant. Sometimes it just means that the wife is the rock of the family. She keeps everyone centered. Liz Sennett was very much the rock of her family. Her husband Charles was a preacher and the center of their church, but together they were the center of their community. And Liz was very much the heart of her family, as one of her sons put it. It's not easy being a preacher's wife, but she performed the role with the same grace and love that she did being a wife and mother. When she was murdered, naturally, Charles was the first suspect. The husband always is. But Charles had a solid alibi. Who would want to hurt this lovely and loving woman? Liz Sennett had no enemies. The brutality shook their small Alabama town, and especially congregants of their church. And the truth would destroy the Sennett family. Welcome to episode 190, The Murder of Liz Sennett. In the 1980s, Ronnie May was an investigator with the Colbert County Sheriff's Department in Alabama. And he wasn't new to this job, far from it. He had started his law enforcement career over a decade earlier in 1973. And he enjoyed the work, because Ronnie would continue to be an officer of the law for over 40 years, only retiring in 2015. But back in the 80s, Ronnie wasn't anywhere near retiring. On March 18th of 1988, it was a cool spring day. The high was in the 40s. The rolling hills of Colbert County were bright green with new life. The breeze was light and airy. It was the perfect kind of day for a morning coffee and a big breath of fresh air. As Ronnie opened the door to the sheriff's department that morning, he might have thought the same, but not for long. At 11:44 a.m. that day, a local pastor, 45-year-old Charles Sennett, called the Colbert County Sheriff's Department, and a secretary answered. But the preacher, Charles, was unintelligible, screaming. The secretary couldn't make out what he was trying to say, and at that point, the call was transferred to Officer Ronnie May. Ronnie waited for Charles to gather himself. Only then could Charles explain to Ronnie what had happened. And it was horrible. Charles's wife, 45-year-old Elizabeth Liz Dorleen Sennett, was dead. Charles didn't know how, he didn't know who, but his and Liz's home had been ransacked, and Liz was covered in blood, lying on the floor of their den. Years later, Ronnie May told AL.com, all we knew was a pastor's wife had been killed in what had been a home invasion. Ronnie rushed to the Sennett home near Tuscumbia, Alabama, along with other first responders. When they arrived, Liz still had a pulse, but it was faint. In the hopes that she would wake up and say something, anything, about her killer's identity, Ronnie rode with her in the ambulance to the hospital. But Liz's eyes never opened. She died in surgery 2 hours later. Thus, the investigation into her murder began. And sometime later, after the dust had settled and the case was solved, Ronnie realized something strange. He had seen Liz's killer before, and it was only a few weeks before her murder. Ronnie had been at a gas station in Cherokee, an Alabama town about 15 miles away from the Sennett's home. This, too, had been a crime scene. The owner of the gas station had been shot and killed. Ronnie and other officers were investigating the gas station when he noticed a strange man following him around. The man appeared to be part of the rescue squad, according to Ronnie, but the man was in the way. He asked him to leave multiple times, but for whatever reason, the man kept returning. Later, Ronnie would speculate that this man was trying to understand how law enforcement investigated a crime scene. He was doing reconnaissance, but at the time, there was no way for Officer Ronnie May to know that. So when the man left, Ronnie let him, and he didn't think much of it. Elizabeth Dorleen Thorne was born on December 10, 1942, to parents Howard and Dosha in Franklin County, Alabama. Throughout her life, her friends and family referred to her as Liz, so that's what we'll call her too. Growing up, Liz was the oldest of her 2 brothers and 1 sister. And of the 4 Thorne children, Liz was especially soft-spoken. She was a quiet young woman with a typical Type A personality. Liz liked things to be neat and organized. She was a person who had a place for everything, and everything was always in its place. Liz also enjoyed being a particularly feminine woman. Her family would later describe her as a girly girl. The Thorne family was born and bred in Alabama for generations, and I'm not just saying that. Liz's parents, her parents' parents, and their parents' parents were all born in the northwest corner of Alabama. Liz too, of course, but her family moved to Ohio sometime between 1948 and 1961, during the time Liz's father spent in the military. The family moved to a home near Cleveland when Liz was in her teens, and there she met a young man named Charles. Charles Edward Sennett was born on October 23, 1942, in Henlawson, West Virginia, to parents Ed and Bevia. Ed was a preacher, and Liz and Charles had a great deal in common. They both lived in Ohio, but were Southerners at heart. They were both the same age, and they were both Christian folk, and so were their families. But most importantly, the young couple fell deeply in love with each other. So on June 2, 1962, 20-year-old Liz and 20-year-old Charles were married in Ohio. And literally 9 months exactly after their wedding date, on February 3, 1963, Liz and Charles welcomed their first child into the world, a baby boy named Charles Jr. They called him Chuck. And 2 years after that, in May of 1965, Liz and Charles had yet another baby boy. His name was Michael, and he would go by Mike. Chuck and Mike remember their parents' relationship as idyllic. In an interview with American Monster, Chuck said, "Dad loved and adored Mother. She was the best thing that ever happened to him." And Mike affirmed, saying, "Everyone thought of them as the perfect couple." Liz and Charles weren't just picture-perfect spouses. They were good parents, too. According to Mike, Liz was like a big mama hen, keeping everybody in check. It was clear that she cared about her sons, and she wasn't afraid to show it. She went above and beyond to make sure both Chuck and Mike knew that she loved them. Through joyful birthday parties, meaningful Christmas gifts, and a ton of special family traditions. Chuck explained that their family was, quote, "always rich in faith and health. We had what we needed and some of what we wanted." And Charles did his part too. Chuck explained that his father was always a hard worker and a great provider. But more than that, he remembered his dad as an all-around nice guy. When baby Mike was born, Charles and Liz were about 23 years old. Around this time, Charles worked at a Sears department store in Ohio. But that wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a preacher. Remember, Charles's father had been a preacher, and Charles knew that it was his life's calling to follow in his father's footsteps. This probably didn't surprise anyone who knew Charles. After all, he was an excellent speaker and a strong leader. Chuck told American Monster, "A preacher has to know what they're talking about. People have to believe in what they're saying, and that came natural to him." But in order to fulfill his dream of sharing God's word, Charles felt he couldn't stay in Ohio. So the young Sennett family left behind one life and began another, this time in Nashville, Tennessee. Mike recalled that this big move felt like a leap of faith, but in the end, it appeared to be worth it. In Nashville, Charles began attending evening classes for up-and-coming preachers under the Church of Christ, and 3 years later, he graduated. He and Liz were about 26 years old. Almost immediately, he was offered a full-time position at the Hatton Church of Christ in Hatton, Alabama. I'm sure Charles and Liz were both relieved and excited by this news. For one, a job is a job. There's nothing like financial security. But for two, Liz's parents now lived in Alabama. I'm sure it was nice to be closer to them and their extended families. And Charles thrived in Alabama. Before he arrived at the Hatton Church of Christ, it was a small church community. The tiny town of Hatton only has about 60 people in it today. While there isn't data available on what Hatton's population was at this time, we know that it hasn't had over 200 people in it for over 10 years. But after Charles became the pastor, people flocked from miles away to hear him speak. According to Chuck, they had to build a bigger church, one that could hold up to 300 or 400 people. Needless to say, Charles was doing very well as a pastor, and both Liz and Charles became central pillars of the Hatton community. Mike told American Monster, whether it be the elderly ladies of the church, the Boy Scouts, Cub Scouts, teaching, graduation, GED classes, you name it, they were involved in the community and everybody knew them. And church was central to the Sennett family. Liz and the two boys always attended Charles's services. Chuck recalled that Sunday morning, you knew where you were going. Sundays probably felt like a weekly celebration for the Sennetts, because after Charles led the Sunday service, he and Liz would invite guests over. They hosted parties, dinners, and other events. And actual holidays like Christmases and birthdays were happy times in the Sennett house too. American Monster showed some old home movies from one Christmas, as Chuck explained that both sets of grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all came together. Chuck and Mike remember these gatherings fondly. In fact, they remember most of their childhood fondly. Mike said, "You couldn't ask for better times." And believe it or not, Charles wasn't just known as a powerful preacher, a welcoming host, and a beloved father. He was also known for his golden singing voice. Mike said he had a deep voice. He could sing deeper than he could talk. In Charles's childhood, his family sang regularly. At one point, they even formed a singing quartet. Charles loved singing in this quartet with his family. Throughout his adult life, Charles was always in one a cappella group or another. On top of preaching and singing, Charles also started his own side venture. He sold burial vaults. These are the outer containers that hold a casket. Most cemeteries require them, so the demand is pretty high, and that made Charles's business pretty successful. Plus, it was another way for him to provide for his wife and sons. But between his full-time job as a preacher, his hobbies, and his side business, Charles was overwhelmed. In 1976, 34-year-old Charles was really starting to feel the pressure. Mike said, "I could tell there was a tiredness to him." One night, Liz called Charles at his burial vault business, but he didn't pick up. She called again and again, but still, no Charles. Concerned, Liz went to the business to check on him, and she found him in the midst of a nervous breakdown. Fortunately, Charles was able to get the medical attention he needed. His doctors diagnosed him with depression and prescribed him lithium. But unfortunately, his doctors also recommended that he give up preaching for good. At this, Charles was heartbroken. Mike recalled, "It was like he was empty, an empty, broken down man, and Mom had to step in and be the rock, and she did a very good job of it." In light of Charles's mental health struggles, he quit his job as a pastor, and Liz became a secretary. She had to pay the bills. But after about 2 years, Charles was feeling up to preaching again, and in 1978, he returned to the pulpit. And he traveled some. In 1978, the Montgomery Advertiser reported that Charles officiated about one wedding or funeral a month at the East Tallahassee Church of Christ, which is over 240 miles away from Hatton and Colbert County, where Liz and Charles lived. Like many who battle mental health issues, Charles wasn't fully cured during his time off from preaching. It just doesn't work that way. And several years later, around 1983, Charles's psychologist wrote a letter to a neurosurgeon. In that letter, the psychologist discussed Charles's irregular mood swings, how he could go from exhilarated to depressed in no time at all. It's unclear what became of this letter. Perhaps Charles was looking for some sort of surgery to help with his emotional balances. The court documents that mention the letter didn't say. Meanwhile, Charles and Liz's little boys were growing up, and to Liz's delight, they were starting to have children of their own. And Liz, more than almost anything else, loved being a grandmother. Chuck said his parents were giddy when their first grandchild was born, especially Mama, he added. When you hear grandmother, you probably picture little old ladies with gray hair. But in 1988, Charles and Liz were both 45 years old. They had been young parents, and now they were young grandparents. They lived on Coondog Cemetery Road in Colbert County, near Tuscumbia, Alabama. At this time, Charles was one of the pastors at the local Church of Christ in Sheffield, Alabama, about 10 minutes from small-town Tuscumbia, a beautiful little city with less than 10,000 residents at the time. On the morning of Friday, March 18th, Charles left his home at about 7:30 in the morning to do some work at the church. He grabbed some fast food before and visited some Sheffield area residents after. Then around 11:30 a.m., he headed home. And by 11:44 a.m., Charles called the Colbert County Sheriff's Department and spoke to investigator Ronnie May. As I mentioned earlier, a very upset Charles explained to Ronnie that he had arrived home to find Liz dead. She was partially wrapped in an Afghan rug and had been badly beaten and stabbed. And Charles said he believed the murder weapon to be a fireplace implement. Shortly after his call, emergency responders came to help Liz. She was actually still alive, but barely breathing. They transported her to the Helen Keller Memorial Hospital in Sheffield. But 2 hours later, Liz passed away during surgery. Later, medical experts would determine that, in addition to being brutally beaten, Liz had suffered 10 stab wounds, 8 to her chest and 1 to either side of her neck. She also had defensive wounds, as well as slashes across her head. Investigator Ronnie May later said, "She fought it and she fought hard." By several eyewitness accounts, Liz's body was badly mangled following this attack. I won't go into too much detail, but in almost every appeals document I read, one lawyer or another argued that the photos of Liz's body shouldn't have been allowed in court. That's how gruesome they were. 45-year-old Elizabeth Dorleen Sennett was buried in the Dempsey Cemetery in Red Bay, Franklin County, Alabama. She is buried in the same cemetery as her parents, Dosha and Howard Thorne. Liz's mother had passed away 7 years earlier, in 1981. She'd only been 59 years old. Howard outlived them both, dying at the age of 87 in 2009. In the wake of his mother's death, Mike Sennett told the Montgomery Advertiser that he regretted she didn't have more time to spoil her grandchildren. Right away, the authorities suspected that Liz's murder was the result of a burglary gone wrong. But as they inspected the crime scene more closely, the detectives started to realize things weren't adding up. Officer Buddy Aldridge told the Birmingham Post-Herald, "It just looked strange from the very beginning." No one had seen Liz's killer. After all, Liz and Charles lived in a rural area, and the nearest neighbor was at work when the attack happened. So all the detectives had was the crime scene, and they meticulously cataloged it for several days. That's how they determined that the crime scene had been staged. As the authorities investigated the crime scene where Liz Sennett was killed, they realized that this couldn't have been a burglary gone wrong. Hardly anything was missing from the Sennett house, just a stereo and a VCR. Numerous valuable items were left behind, and hundreds of dollars in Liz's purse remained untouched. Plus, there was no sign of forced entry, which meant Liz might have let the killer inside her house willingly, as if she knew them or was at least comfortable enough to open the door for them. Now, authorities were even more suspicious. During their investigation, one officer saw something odd floating in the pond located about 50 yards from Charles and Liz's house. It was a broken piece of a walking cane. Another portion of that same cane was found in the Sennett's den near Liz's body. Authorities quickly deduced that the cane had been one of the many items used to brutally beat Liz. so they drained the pond to see if more weapons were there. And there were. According to the Birmingham Post-Herald, law enforcement agents discovered more pieces of the walking cane, a fire poker, and a black-handled hunting knife. Back inside the Sennett's home, investigating officials also found several hair strands near Liz's body. These hair strands were discovered in two places: the rug that had been draped across Liz's body and a baseball cap the attacker had presumably left behind. Today, hair strands are a great find at a crime scene. It's DNA evidence, right? Well, as long as you find one with a hair follicle. Even without the follicle, it can be powerful circumstantial evidence. But back in 1988, the technology to compare DNA in forensic science had only just been invented. It wouldn't be mainstream until the 90s, and even then there would be a long wait before databases like CODIS would help solve cases consistently. Still, the labs could easily conclude that these hairs did not belong to Liz, and they didn't belong to Charles either. There were also fibers found on the hunting knife that appeared to match the rug on Liz's body. Now detectives were at an impasse. They had the murder weapons, but no murderer. And they had zero suspects, so they couldn't compare these mysterious hair strands to anyone else's hair. Not to mention, Charles's time was easily accounted for during the time Liz was killed, so he couldn't have done it. And most of the people Liz knew had strong alibis too. Investigators were baffled. Who could have killed Liz Sennett? Who would have wanted to? She didn't have any enemies. She was an active member of the community, a caring mother and grandmother, the pastor's wife. And whoever had murdered Liz did it for almost nothing. They didn't even take the remote that went with the VCR. The Alabama Bureau of Investigation became involved in Liz's case early on, but still, days passed with no new leads. The people of Sheffield, Tuscumbia, and other surrounding Colbert County cities were terrified. A killer was on the loose, and it probably felt like if Liz Sennett could be killed, then no one was safe. But by a stroke of sheer luck, the Colbert County Sheriff's Department received a lead. A member of Charles's congregation contacted the authorities. They had somehow come across a Valentine's Day card that was addressed to Charles. But it wasn't from Liz. It was from a different woman. This woman was a member of Charles's church too, and was also a close friend of the Sennett family. Immediately, the investigators brought the woman in for questioning, and she confirmed what the Valentine's Day card had implied. According to author Tim Kent, who wrote Murder from the Pulpit, the woman lawyered up, presumably after confirming the affair and admitting that Charles had borrowed money from her. Detectives could also have gotten a warrant for bank records, though. But now they knew for sure that Charles was cheating on Liz with this woman. Detective Ronnie May could now view his interactions with Charles on the day of Liz's murder in a different light. He could see clearly how Charles had seemed especially shocked when they realized that Liz still had a heartbeat. According to May, Charles almost fell at the news. In total, the authorities brought Charles in for questioning 3 times. The first 2 times, he denied any involvement in his wife's death. But according to the authorities, Charles's story kept changing. But that's pretty typical. It's hard to remember specific details at specific times. I'm not sure the deputies or sheriffs really thought Charles was involved until this 3rd questioning, because this time, when the officer spoke to Charles, they weren't messing around. They told Charles they knew about his affair, and they knew that he had borrowed $3,000 from his girlfriend in the weeks leading up to Liz's death. Charles agreed, yes, he had an affair, and yes, he had borrowed that money, but he wouldn't tell the officers what he had spent it on, and he denied that he had been involved in Liz's murder. But the detectives were not having it. By the end of it, they told Charles that he was a suspect, and they arranged for him to undergo a polygraph test the following week. Still, Charles was adamant that he didn't do it. He didn't kill his wife. But as he stood up to leave, one of the interrogating officers made one final comment. The officer said something along the lines of, "I wonder if Charles knows Kenny Smith." And according to Officer Ronnie May, Charles's face turned beet red. Kenny Smith, who we'll get to momentarily, was known as a bad actor in the Colbert County area. And Kenny wasn't above taking money in exchange for murder. It was Friday, March 25th, 1988, that Charles spoke with the authorities for the third and final time. He didn't take the news well that he was now a suspect. Afterwards, he got in his pickup truck and drove to a family member's house. There, his sons Chuck and Mike and their families were gathered. After Charles arrived, he told his two sons that he had cheated on their mother with this woman from the church. Right away, Chuck and Mike were met with a whirlwind of feelings. Mike told American Monster, "I'm mad. My emotions were running. You just lost your wife, and now you're having an affair. You're a preacher, man of the cloth. You're not supposed to be doing that." But Charles wasn't done yet. He had more to tell his two sons. He told them that he was to blame for their mother's death. And then he walked out of the house. He climbed into the front seat of his truck and picked up his .22 caliber gun and shot himself in the head. Chuck and Mike heard the blast, and then they watched as their father closed his eyes for the very last time. Only 1 week after they lost their mother. Later, the authorities found a note in Charles's pocket. While the contents of this note have not been released verbatim, Officer Buddy Aldridge told reporters that the note indicated the following: that Charles had never hurt his wife and that he had gotten in with some bad guys, and he did not want to cause the family any more embarrassment. Just like after Liz's death, Officer Ronnie May was one of the first people to arrive at the scene of Charles's death. And also, just like with Liz, Ronnie rode with Charles in the ambulance on the way to the Helen Keller Memorial Hospital. Again, he was hoping that Charles would say something, that in Charles's final words, he might explain what he meant when he said he was to blame for Liz's murder. But he didn't say anything, and the doctors at the hospital declared Charles dead at 6:40 p.m. Liz Sennett's murder case was already high profile in this area of Alabama. A pastor's wife being horribly bludgeoned and stabbed to death was scandalous enough on its own. But after Charles's suicide, this case's publicity shot into the stratosphere. There was a sense of disbelief, like this was all a TV show, not real life. And the 200 members of Charles's congregation were devastated. They had known Charles. They had known Liz. How could any of this have happened? Charles's associate pastor, Gerald Sockwell, told the Alabama Journal that the whole situation, quote, has got us all torn up. But even though it seemed like Charles's suicide meant that he was involved in Liz's murder, it still wasn't clear who had actually killed Liz. Charles couldn't have. He was with other people at different locations. And of course, someone else's hair strands were found at the crime scene. So, due in part to the massive publicity this case was getting, Alabama Governor Guy Hunt advertised a $10,000 reward for any information about Liz's murder. That's about $26,000 in today's money. On March 29, 1988, an anonymous female called the Colbert County Sheriff's Department. She asked about the reward, and Officer Ronnie May directed her to make the call through Crime Stoppers to receive the money. So she did. And then the anonymous tipster told Ronnie May and other relevant officers exactly who was responsible for Liz's death. And it wasn't just one person, it was 3, none of whom were Charles Sennett, though his hands weren't clean either. Now I'm going to tell you the series of events that led to the heart-wrenching murder of 45-year-old Liz Sennett. Most of this information was gained from the anonymous tipster. But for clarity, I've supplemented the details the tipster left out with court documents, the perpetrator's confessions, and newspaper articles relating to this case. About a month before Liz's murder, sometime in February of 1988, Charles Sennett was feeling trapped. Somehow he had accrued massive financial debt, and he was cheating on his wife. So figuring he could kill 2 birds with one stone, Charles took out a life insurance policy for Liz, and then he orchestrated her murder. Author Tim Kent pointed out what he thought was the main motive. As a preacher in the Church of Christ, Charles would believe marriage was sacred, and he couldn't divorce Liz unless she had committed adultery. The only other way out is for her to die, he said. That may be true, but it seems to me that murder is a much bigger sin than divorce. I would think Charles was motivated not only by his feelings for his mistress, but also money. Those are the two biggest reasons people kill in this world. As Charles schemed, he made sure to do his research. And at least once he followed the unsuspecting officer Ronnie May around the gas station crime scene that we discussed at the top of the episode. Once Charles had a plan, he reached out to 21-year-old Billy Gray Williams. Billy rented an apartment from Charles in Florence, Alabama. For reference, Florence is less than 10 miles away from where Charles and Liz lived near Tuscumbia. Charles explained to Billy that he needed to hire someone to kill his wife. It's not clear why Charles entrusted Billy with that information, but he did. Maybe Billy was the only criminal-type person Charles knew. Charles said he could get $3,000 to pay for the assassination. That's less than $8,000 in 2023 money. From there, Billy reached out to his close friend, 22-year-old Kenneth Eugene Smith, who went by Kenny. Billy and Kenny had known each other for a long time. They had gone to high school together. So when Billy called up Kenny and asked him to come to his apartment for a chat, Kenny probably didn't think anything of it. But as they sat on Billy's front porch in the late afternoon, Billy told Kenny about the murder for hire plot, and then he asked Kenny if he would kill Charles's wife. Billy explained how they could split Charles's money 50-50, each getting $1,500, which is about $3,800 in today's money. At first, Kenny wasn't sure. He told Billy he would think about it. Kenny and Billy revisited the topic a few more times as Kenny pondered. 2 weeks before the murder was scheduled, Kenny met Charles through a meeting that Billy arranged. Charles had never met Kenny before, and the two men did not exchange names. Charles said that he wanted somebody taken care of. And then he proceeded to pitch to Kenny why he should murder his wife, though he didn't say wife yet. Charles just reassured Kenny that the target would be at home alone during the time of the murder. He also said there would be no visitors at the house because this person never had any visitors, and he explained that the house was in a rural area, so no one would be nearby. Kenny listened to Charles's proposal and told him he would get back to him. He gave Charles his phone number, which Charles used to call Kenny multiple times. He wanted to know if Kenny had decided. Would he do it or not? About a week before the murder was to occur, in early March of 1988, Charles heard back. Kenny would do it. And Kenny had also enlisted another young man in the murder for hire plot. This was 19-year-old John Forrest Parker. He had gone to school with Billy and Kenny also. They were all three friends from Florence, Alabama. And as a brief sidebar, Kenny had actually asked another friend of his to join him in murdering Liz before John, but that friend said no. With John in the picture, he, Billy, and Kenny would now receive $1,000 each, about $2,500 in today's money. Neither Kenny nor John ever knew Charles or Liz's names. On Tuesday, March 15th, Charles and Kenny met at a coffee house. There, Charles drew a diagram of his and Liz's home. He explained to Kenny that the target was his wife. Originally, Liz's murder was to happen the next day on Wednesday, March 16th. Charles was going to Birmingham for a doctor's appointment, but Liz unexpectedly decided to go with him that Wednesday. So Charles rescheduled the murder to that Friday, March 18th. Billy, Kenny, and Charles met one more time before the murder on that Thursday. They met outside of Billy's apartment in Charles's silver car. John wasn't there. Earlier that day, Charles had cashed a check for $3,000. He had borrowed the money from his girlfriend. She'd had no idea what it was for. Charles only told her he needed to pay some debts. Now Charles gave Kenny $200. He told him that this was to front the cost for any supplies needed to kill Liz. And Charles also showed Kenny that he had the remaining cash in hand. Charles also explained that he wanted Liz's death to appear like a burglary gone wrong. He told Kenny to steal whatever he wanted from his and Liz's house. They all agreed that Kenny and John would do the murder and Billy would hold the money. After they murdered Liz, they would go to Billy's apartment and he would give them their remaining shares of the cash. Charles told Kenny that he would be out of the house from 8 a.m. to noon the next day. So that's how long Kenny and Johnny had to kill Liz. Later, Billy gave John $100 of the $200 that Charles had given to Kenny. John was supposed to use that $100 to buy a handgun to kill Liz, but John, who is a self-admitted drug addict, did not do that. Instead, he bought drugs. At about 9:30 a.m. on Friday, March 18th, Kenny and John loaded themselves into John's gold 1978 Pontiac Grand Prix. First, they drove to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, a city very close to Florence, Tuscumbia, and Sheffield, though I'm not sure why. Then they made their way to Charles and Liz's house. Sometime during this drive, John shot up 3 cc's of Talwin, which is an opioid, so he was high. It's a narcotic that's been discontinued because of the high risk of addiction. And as John drove to the Sennett house, Kenny sharpened a 6-inch hunting knife. John had brought the knife since he had used the money for the gun on drugs. Once the two men arrived at Liz's house, they parked near her patio, then knocked on the door. When Liz answered, Kenny and John explained that they wanted to explore her land for a potential hunting area. They said that her husband, who they didn't know as Charles, had told them they could do this. Liz was understandably a little weirded out. She asked them for their names and then called Charles to make sure what they were saying was true. Charles apparently confirmed Kenny and John's information. He told Liz to let the two guys walk around their property. As Kenny and John walked around outside, she stayed inside. Later, John would admit to the authorities that he didn't know why he and Kenny didn't jump Liz when she first opened the door. Perhaps they got cold feet. Regardless, after Kenny and John made a show of exploring the property, they came back to the door. They knocked again and Liz answered. This time the men asked if they could use her bathroom and get a drink of water. Liz agreed and let them into her house. First, Kenny used the bathroom, then John went. As John was in the bathroom, Kenny made conversation with Liz. When John came out, he had placed cotton socks on his hands, presumably to hide his fingerprints. But maybe not. One court document stated that both Kenny and John were wearing gloves due to the cool weather. This is when the two men attacked. It's unclear who did exactly what. Kenny would later claim that he never laid a hand on Liz, that it was only John who attacked her. Kenny described John's actions as frenzied, but John said the opposite, that it was Kenny who had actually killed Liz. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that these two evil men beat Liz Sennett so viciously that she was, according to court documents, struggling for her life. Officials believe that any item within reach of the two men was used against Liz, including a galvanized pipe, a walking cane, multiple fireplace tools, and a chair. All the while, Liz was begging them not to hurt her. And then one of them, we're not sure who, stabbed Liz 10 times. Then Kenny and John overturned the house. They grabbed the stereo and the VCR, and they broke the medicine cabinet. A china hutch was also overturned. Afterward, John threw the stereo in a nearby river. Kenny took the VCR home. The men said at the time that they left, Liz was still alive. They could hear her gurgled breathing as blood entered her lungs. Then John and Kenny went to Billy's apartment where they got the rest of their money, and then they disposed of their bloody clothing. The authorities wanted to believe that this anonymous tipster was telling the truth. She knew so many details. It would be crazy if this was just some random person sending them on a wild goose chase. For example, the tipster knew that on the day of Liz's murder, Billy used his share of the money to buy a waterbed from Waterworld. And the tipster knew all about the stolen VCR now at Kenny's house, that it did not have a remote because that was left behind at the Sennett's house. Its make, its model, its serial number, that Liz's blood was still spattered on it. But the local authorities of Colbert County still had to verify this information. So the stolen VCR became very important. It tied Kenny to Liz's murder. Authorities hoped that once they had Kenny in hand, he would fold. Then Billy and John would come shortly after. So the officers found the box that the VCR came in. Mike's wife, Kim, had gifted the VCR to her in-laws and presumably knew where the box was. Now, they could match the serial number of Liz's stolen VCR to the VCR allegedly sitting in Kenny's house. So at about 3 p.m. on March 31st, about 2 weeks following Liz's murder, the police obtained a search warrant for Kenny's home. Within 10 minutes, they found the VCR and confirmed the matching serial number. And yes, Liz's blood was still on the VCR. On the same day that the officers raided Kenny's home, Kenny, Billy, and John were arrested. John and Kenny were charged with capital murder, and Billy was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The legality of whether or not the authorities had enough grounds to arrest these men at the time they did was questioned at length. Ultimately, Kenny confessed to everything immediately, and John did too. Based on those two confessions, the officers definitely had the legal right to arrest Billy. But the timeline of when these young men were all taken into police custody versus when they were arrested versus the confessions that would allow them to be arrested is shaky. But ultimately, the courts would let that slide in the appeals process. I imagine there was a fair amount of grace given, considering that these 3 men had killed an innocent woman in cold blood. Each of the 3 men were tried separately. First up was Billy Gray Williams' trial. It happened in January of 1989. According to the Birmingham Post-Herald, he was convicted of capital murder. Sometime throughout the legal proceedings, Billy must have been upgraded from his initial charge of conspiracy to commit murder. Almost no details about Billy's trial are available in the public record. But we do know that, a month later, in February of 1989, Billy was sentenced to life in prison without parole. All of his appeals were denied. On November 22nd of 2020, Billy Gray Williams died in prison. He was about 53 years old, and he had spent 31 years in prison. The next trial was that of John Forrest Parker. It began on May 30th, 1989. According to court documents, both the prosecution and defense agreed that John was guilty of assault and conspiracy to commit assault, but the defense claimed that John had no intent to kill Liz, just badly hurt her. John's defense attorneys went on to say that John actually left Liz in okay health, as in she was beaten but not near death, and that it was Charles, not John, who returned to the home, pulled out his own knife, and stabbed Liz to death. That is, in my opinion, bullshit. Where was the second knife then? Where was Charles's bloody clothing? How did John know he left her closer to life than death? Did John take her vitals as he walked out the door? Pull out a blood pressure cuff? I don't buy it. And neither did the jury, especially because one witness testified that John had explicitly told him he was going to kill somebody with Kenny Smith. John did not testify, and after deliberating for about 1 hour, the jury found him guilty of capital murder. They recommended that he be sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the judge disagreed. He sentenced John to death. And after he exhausted all of his appeals in the state and federal courts, 42-year-old John Parker was executed at 6:41 p.m. on June 10, 2010. He died by lethal injection. His last meal was fried fish, French fries, and iced tea. He had spent 21 years in prison. In the time leading up to John's death, Liz's son Mike told the Montgomery Advertiser, "His family has had 20 years to say goodbye, and I never had that. All I wanted was an apology, and he's had 20 years to give me one, and he still hasn't given me one to this day." Moments before John's execution, he was asked if he had any last words. At this, he turned to Liz's sons, Chuck and Mike, who were both present, and said, "I'm sorry. I don't ever expect you to forgive me. I really am sorry." Then he told his friends that he appreciated everything and he loved them, and then he died. The last trial was for Kenneth Eugene Smith. It took place in October 1989. This was the only trial of the 3 men that was granted a change of venue. By this point, Liz's case was incredibly well known, so they moved Kinney's trial from Colbert County, Alabama to Jackson County, and the judge also placed a gag order. Kinney's defense was based wholly on blaming John. John was the one who killed Liz, not Kinney. Kinney claimed that he never touched her, and his lawyers also argued that he too never thought he was supposed to kill Liz just to beat her up. But this, of course, was not true. It was a desperate man facing the consequences of his own actions. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes before convicting Kinney of capital murder, and then they recommended that he be sentenced to death. Kinney, like John and Billy, appealed his case at length. But Kinney, unlike John and Billy, was the only one to be granted a new trial. It was on a technicality. The trial court judge did not enter a detailed explanation about the aggravating and mitigating circumstances required to sentence someone to death. Kinney's second trial took place in 1996. He was reconvicted. This time, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without parole. But the judge disagreed and sentenced Kinney to death. Today, Kinney is in the Holman prison in Atmore, Alabama. He is about 57 years old. He was originally scheduled to be executed at 6 p.m. on November 17, 2022. But Kinney was able to pull some last-minute legal shenanigans. Long story short, the U.S. Supreme Court was forced to review Kinney's case on the literal day of his execution. The medical staff in charge of his execution was given the go-ahead at about 10:22 p.m. But the warrant for Kinney's death penalty expired at midnight. They had 90 minutes to do a process that was originally given 6 hours. When the medical team struggled to place Kinney's second IV line, they called off the execution at 11:20 p.m. At that point, there wouldn't have been enough time for the lethal injection to kill Kinney before the warrant ran out. This was a very big deal in Alabama, and that's because it happened in the wake of criticism over Alabama's lethal injection process. In July of 2022, convicted murderer Joe Nathan James Jr. was executed following a 3-hour-long delay after they struggled to successfully set up his IV line. In September of 2022, the execution of convicted murderer Alan Eugene Miller failed after the execution team couldn't find a suitable vein. There were and are rampant allegations that Alabama's lethal injection process is at best flawed and at worst inhumane. After Kinney's failed execution in November of 2022, Alabama paused all executions. They were internally reviewing their procedures. They resumed in the summer of 2023. Kinney was able to use this bungled execution as an opportunity to lobby for his right to die by a new method in Alabama. It's called nitrogen hypoxia. Basically, an inmate is forced to breathe in nitrogen until they die from the lack of oxygen. Meanwhile, his lawyers are also trying to stop the second execution attempt. They wrote in a court filing, to subject Mr. Smith to a second execution by lethal injection would subject him to the torturous experience of unnecessary physical and psychological pain, as has been established through Alabama's last 3 execution attempts. I know these lawyers are doing their job, and I know Kinney just wants another day on this earth. But it's hard not to compare words like torturous experience and unnecessary physical and psychological pain without thinking of what Liz must have gone through. When I first read about this case, I thought it was incredibly sad, but basically another spousal murder-for-hire case. But the devil is truly in the details here. How could a preacher, a loving father and husband, do this? How could 3 men agree to murder Liz Sennett for just $1,000 each? That's still only about $2,500 today. I suppose the answer to the killers is drugs. That's why they would kill Liz for so little money. Addiction is a terrible disease, but murder is an unspeakable choice. But Charles is even harder to understand. From all sources, he was a devoted preacher and family man. There had never been one hint that he was capable of something like this. An affair was inconceivable to his sons, but to orchestrate their mother's murder? His suicide was sadly not as shocking. Charles had long suffered with mental health issues, and I suppose the guilt of what he had done was too much for him to live with. Liz Sennett was only 45 years old when she was viciously murdered. She had so much of her life ahead of her. She had grandbabies to cherish, sons to watch grow older. Her hopes and dreams were smashed to pieces. Her sons were devastated. And the moment they had to process what their father had done, he killed himself basically in front of them. I cannot even imagine the sort of pain and grief. They have had 35 years to live with this horror. Perhaps Kenny's execution will give them closure. Perhaps not. Many people believe that there is no such thing as closure. And with a crime this monstrous, I'm inclined to agree. Southern Fried True Crime is hosted and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched and written by Andrea Marshbank, with additional research and writing by myself, and of course, all editorial opinions are my own. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Today's episode was edited and mixed by Brandon Schexnayder of Southern Gothic and Erica Kelley. If you have any case suggestions, please go to my website and click on the listener suggestion tab, or email sftcresearch@gmail.com. Please remember that I do not accept suggestions on social media private messages. The research tab on southernfriedtruecrime.com is the best way for me to get those little-known cases y'all always send me. But please come join our Facebook group, Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group, where we swap recipes, worship Dolly Parton, and share memes. I much prefer spending my social media time in our lovely group. We do, of course, discuss true crime, not just Southern Fried, but all kinds. But it is still very much a Southern lifestyle group. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit asses allowed. It's not just a motto, it's how we run the group. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on all large platforms like iHeart, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, and YouTube. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.